everyone. Welcome to Freedom is the Cure. I'm Paul Dragu, the Communications Director for the John Birch Society. Thanks for tuning in. So in 1920, right as World War I ended, globalists prompted the creation of the League of Nations, the first intergovernmental organization. The main selling point for the League of Nations was to prevent another war, like the devastating one that had just concluded. Sounds good, right? What sensible person wouldn't want that? But the American public wasn't buying it, despite a pro-League of Nations propaganda campaign against them. Back then, Americans wanted nothing to do with any intergovernmental clubs as much as they wanted nothing to do with war. Years prior, they had elected Woodrow Wilson in large part because he promised not to get us in Europe's war. We know how that turned out. Nevertheless, 58 member countries managed to be duped into the League of Nations, but not the US. But by the 1930s, another war was brewing in Europe, and soon it would erupt into a full-blown world war. The League of Nations died soon after, followed by 85 million casualties of the Second World War. But after World War II, the intergovernmental organization was resurrected, this time in the form of the United Nations. And this time, the United States was a founding member. Interestingly, one of the founders of the UN was a man named Alger Hiss. At the time, he was a U.S. State Department official and a Soviet spy, of which he was convicted later. The United Nations was supposedly founded to, you guessed it, prevent wars. But like the League of Nations, it's done no such thing. As the ink on the UN Charter was drying, the Cold War was beginning and would continue for decades. And after the establishment of the UN, several deadly conflicts would erupt around the world, including the Korean and Vietnam Wars, 2 Iraq wars, a 2 decades-long quagmire in the Middle East, and several others in between. And right now, as I speak, there's a war in Eastern Europe involving a country with a nuclear arsenal the size of Rhode Island. And it's been going on for 9 months. Where's the UN? The United Nations has obviously failed, at least in its supposed mission. But what's its real goal? And what's the deal with all these wars? In this episode, we're discussing the true relationship between war and the globalists' agenda. But before we dive in, please remember to subscribe to our social media and podcast channels and like and share our episodes. So, I'm fortunate to have back on the show Art Thompson, former CEO of the John Birch Society and the author of a pile of books on the insiders, including International Merger by Foreign Entanglements and In the Shadows of the Deep State. Thanks for joining me again, Art.
Happy to be here.
So, Art, is it just me, or have these intergovernmental organizations completely failed to prevent wars and maybe have even inspired more? There seems to have been quite a few conflicts in this last century.
Well, actually, looking at it, you have to come to the conclusion after a while that they actually help start wars. That they're not in the war stopping business; they're in the war manipulating business, and so they will manipulate wars and as a result get more and more power into the UN and regional structures and so on and so forth.
Well, how does that work? For instance, if the UN goes around and saying we're here to prevent wars and that hasn't happened, first of all, how does it still exist? And secondly, how does it contribute to creating these wars?
Well, first of all, why it still exists is because the people have been fooled into thinking that it is a peace organization instead of a war organization. They're taught that in the schools, and there's a lot of organizations in the United States and around the world, but in the United States, that sell that story to the American people, whether it's the Council on Foreign Relations or the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace or on and on and on and on. Mm-hmm. And so basically, they do these things. They perpetuate war because it is the key to changing governments. War is the biggest catalyst to change.
Yeah.
Because they will manipulate fear. We've talked about that on this program before, how they use fear.
Right.
The biggest fear is war. Yeah, you've got pandemics, economic collapses, any number of different things that government can use to impose new taxes, new regulations, new controls on the people. But war is the one that is the paramount catalyst for control.
Yeah, it paralyzes people.
Oh, yeah, and
their thinking is, their ability to think critically, right?
That's correct. They will stand still for almost anything, and rationing, curtailment of travel, locking up undesirables, any number of different things in the name of the war effort. So that's how they have manipulated the American people for a long time. Actually, and if you really study it, you will find that in most instances, the American people have financed both sides in any war. It's just that they didn't know it.
Yeah?
Well,
go on.
It's awful.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
Well, for one thing, Russia could not exist without American industry. It could not. It never has been able to. You can point to whether it's Boeing or General Electric or any of these corporations helping the Russians in their scientific and industrial efforts.
Right.
On the other hand, it's the same with Ukraine. They have financed the Ukrainian government for decades. And if they don't like the particular individual that the people elected, they actually go into Ukraine and have changed that government. This gal, Victoria Nuland, for instance, who's now in the Biden administration as the political affairs undersecretary of state, she actually changed the government of Ukraine in league with Biden when he was vice president.
She worked for one of the intelligence agencies, correct?
She did at one point, but this was when she was working in the State Department.
Yeah.
And if you recall, too, Biden was caught at a meeting of the Council on Foreign Relations on video, stating that he prevented a certain amount of money in aid going to the Ukrainian government if they didn't stop an investigation into his son Biden by this particular individual in the government of Ukraine. And Ukraine is really if you study the history of Ukraine, I don't know how those people still exist, because Stalin starved millions of them. And then after World War II, Stalin went in and slaughtered even more of them. And it's been that history of the Ukrainian history for decades. Everybody steps on them.
Well, they're fighting back to give them
yes,
credit.
They
That's
are.
for sure. But what is your take on this? How is this? How was this prompted, and what can we even expect after this? We've seen, as I mentioned earlier, it's like after World War I. Well, actually, we didn't mention some of the changes, and we could go into that. But what change can we expect after Ukraine? And what's your take? What's your opinion on what the heck is going to turn out this thing? We're going 9 months in, man, and it doesn't seem like they're interested in peace either. What do you think about that?
Well, they were going to settle very early, but we got mixed up in it and tore that whole thing apart to where they backed away from a settlement.
Was it us or the Brits?
Well, the Brits were involved with us, let's put it that way. And so somebody wants a war. And we pulled out all of our military supposedly when this thing started, but now we're starting to inject military again. This time, ostensibly, to keep an eye on the equipment that we're giving to the Ukrainians.
Yeah.
Now, it's kind of interesting.
Are we going to have an accountant there?
Well, it's kind of the way it is, supposedly. But they claim that there is a claim.
Another tank down.
Yeah, well, no, not that. It's that they're reselling this stuff to other countries.
After Ukraine?
Ukraine's selling this to other countries.
Is there documentation for that? How do we know?
I don't
this?
know. That's what they're claiming.
Who's claiming this?
Well, the government, when you look at the reason they're sending back U.S. military to keep an eye on this military equipment that's actually being used by the Ukrainians against the Russians.
Well, that doesn't sound surprising. I mean, the way the weapons flow in and out of those countries over there, I mean, and it would surprise me if someone's not trying to steal or at least, hustling.
Somebody's trying to make a buck all the time.
Yeah, this is the highest, the highest degree of technology.
But that's how it starts. You see, and then all of a sudden, one of our guys is going to get killed or something.
Yeah.
Well, we need to have more troops over there to protect our.
Yeah, they killed Americans.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's kind of the way it starts, and then it goes on and on and on and on and on.
And where do you see this ending up? Is there going to be a union? I mean, apparently this started. And what do you think of that? The narrative that this started because we kept encroaching on Putin's region there in his backyard, and he said, "Look, we talked about this." And I believe there was a pledge where the United States and NATO said that we will only go thus far, and that's clearly not the case. We try to suck Ukraine in. What do you think of that?
Well, what's going to happen is going to be based on the political atmosphere in the United States. What happens in this upcoming election, the midterm election? How many men and women are of constitutional background and adherence to the Constitution are elected into the United States Congress? That will play a lot of a big part on it, because they need to manipulate people. That's the whole idea behind this thing. And so based on how much they have to manipulate will depend on what they do in Ukraine. If they can do it without actually going full tilt into a war where we are involved, that's what they'll do. But if they need that war, there it is. It's just laying there ready to go.
Let's talk about some of these. Let's go back in time a little bit and talk about some of the changes that were implemented. Maybe we'll go back to World War II. We know there was a great deal. I mean, society changed pretty drastically after World War II.
Society? Which society?
Well,
American society or the world?
Well, I think it's both, but we'd be more interested in the Western world and especially American society. What's your take on that?
Well, American society was caught up into the Cold War. Again, they used fear.
Yeah.
Get under the desk. What would they say? Drop, cover, and whatever.
Well, that was your time, wasn't it? That's when you were in school.
Yeah, they
was that pretty terrifying?
Oh, not really. I mean, it was games to us, us kids. But they convinced everybody that if we didn't, do certain things, then we were going to go into an atomic war.
Yeah.
And so that fear caused an awful lot of organizations and manipulation on the international level, with getting into international entanglements, abrogating the Constitution, taking power away from the people through the Congress into these international organizations. Let me give you just one example.
Go on, please.
We have a lot of trade agreements. The Constitution says that Congress shall regulate trade, but these trade agreements have now taken that away from Congress and placed it in these international agreements, to where Congress no longer can handle the trade.
Name one such agreement.
Well, the latest one, of course, is the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. And they've tried it with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They've tried it with the trying to get us involved with the EU and that sort of thing through the Trilateral Commission and so on and so forth. But if you read these treaties, you discover that Congress virtually has no say-so any longer over our own trade, and yet the Constitution says that's what will happen. So what they do is they amend the Constitution illegally in this process. So that's part of the things that's going on in all of this.
Do they get away with it by saying it's non-binding? That seems to always... It's not a law, right? These aren't laws that they're passing, but they become implemented. They're little pledges, they're little plans. We hear this with the the sustainable development argument all the time. It's like, oh, it's non-binding, and now we're like living it, and it's like, what are you talking about? The ESG scores, of course, and all the green policies that are being implemented.
Well,
so much for non-binding.
They say non-binding, but that's just to get it done.
Yeah.
And then once we have it, then we adhere to it. In the case, like the USMCA, which a lot of conservatives support, here we're now tied to a Marxist government in Canada through Trudeau. And if you really want to know the truth, the Mexican government is Marxist as well. And so what has happened is, in this compromise towards trade, what has happened to our country? We believe in free enterprise, freedom of the individual, and all of that, and we have compromised that position through this so-called free trade agreement. Mm-hmm. It's not even a treaty according to the official statements out of Washington, D.C., but if you talk to Canada or Mexico, they call it a treaty.
Yeah.
We don't call it a treaty.
So these treaties are one way of implementing piece by piece one world government. Let's go back to talking about war, because
Sure.
that's kind of what it's like. How else do they use wars to implement their piece by piece one world government?
Well, first of all, they divide us up into groups. You know, they regionalize us militarily, like NATO, that sort of thing. And so, but the thing is, if you look at the NATO treaty, you know, they scare us about Russia's going to invade Central Europe and then Western Europe, so we need to form a NATO.
Yeah. Except
NATO keeps expanding beyond Europe.
Yeah.
But at any rate, so they scare us into the Russian bear. We go into NATO. We surrender our ability to manage our own armed forces, because if you read the NATO treaty and the United Nations treaty, that gives the power over our own military. If you read those treaties, you'll find it out very quickly.
Well, don't they say that, especially the NATO one, that we're kind of beholden, like if a certain country gets into a conflict, then we have to come in and defend, right?
That's correct.
Well, and that surpasses that congressional approval, right?
That's exactly right. But it already, see, the thing is, the congressional approval has not been a declaration of war since we joined the United Nations. It's been an approval of a United Nations Security Council resolution, and we approved that resolution. We don't have a declaration of war.
We haven't had one since, what, World War II, right?
World War II is the last one.
But yeah, how many conflicts have we been in?
Well, more than I've got fingers and toes.
My goodness. So what are some of the things that get, some of the freedom-crushing policies and laws and edicts that get passed in times of war? You know, anytime now, maybe there's, they've been talking about, nuclear. There's been talk now in major media, obviously coming down from the White House of this nuclear threat and whatnot. And so in the past, what freedom-crushing policies and edicts have we seen from the government that we should be watching out for in this day and age?
Well, there's an exception going on right now, but prior to all the other wars, at some point we've always geared up our industrial capacity for making the accoutrements for war. Mm-hmm. We were a little late getting into it, before World War II, but nonetheless, we were already making planes and cannon and everything else for Britain, so on and so forth, before we were ever in the war.
For Russia, too.
Well, that's true. But we were also helping Germany at the same time. There were a lot of industries in the United States that were helping Germany. And so, but this time it's kind of different, and I haven't been able to figure it out yet. But they are destroying our capacity for war. Take a look at our strategic oil reserves.
Yeah.
I mean, they're depleting our strategic oil reserves, when if we're going to go have a war, we need those. But they're depleting them for political purposes to get the price of the oil down for the election.
All right.
But in addition to that, they have stopped building pipelines, oil exploration, pumping, refining, et cetera, et cetera. So they're not preparing us to win a war. They are preparing us to lose a war, and that's scary.
Or is it who would be prepared to be the victor? Is it the China the China group there?
Well, if we had maintained and would maintain our prowess in the production of war capability, there's no question that we could beat Russia and China as long as we didn't go into mainland Asia. I mean, we can't, we don't have the population to fight the amount of people they have, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So we don't want to get involved in that kind of a war. But when it comes to the technology and the Navy and all of that, we could beat them. That's not a problem.
Well, they say wars change in that sense too. That technology has greatly reduced the need for actual manpower and things like that.
Well, that's what they say. But you just like the Air Force used to say that they could win a war, but it's still a guy in the boots that go in and occupy it afterwards. It's always the guy in the boots. And so. A lot of people might differ with my opinion about the prowess of the Russians and the Chinese, but the Ukrainians have shown the prowess of the Russians, haven't they? And the battlefield, the Ukrainians have been able to beat them.
Wow,
when everybody was saying that Russia will just roll right on over them, but that's not been the case, has it? Because the Russians do not have a very good history of maintaining their equipment.
Yeah, you mentioned that before.
It's terrible. I used to read reports about the tanks that they had and all that, when I was in uniform, about how many thousands of tanks they had ready to roll into Europe, except for one little thing.
They're no good.
Most of them didn't work. They couldn't work.
Why is that? Is it the bureaucracy?
Well, it's just like the beginning of World War II. You know who had the biggest air force in the world at the beginning of World War II?
Was it the Brits?
Russia.
No kidding.
Darn fool things wouldn't fly, though.
Oh, wow.
Because the commissars down in the structure would never want to report upwards their failings in maintaining their equipment.
Yeah, they didn't want their head chopped off.
No, exactly. So a lot of these guys know that their superiors do not stand for failure.
Yeah.
So they lie in their reports.
They're terrified to death, and rightfully so. The history in that part of the country, the way they operate, I was born in that part of the country. I mean, that's part of the world, of course. But I wasn't born in Russia. We were born in a satellite state in Romania. But you knew and you know of, like, the fear, the way they operate by fear, and you would think that by now they have learned that this obviously doesn't work. You have at least a century, if not more, of innovation on the West, where where the military is not threatening you don't have to sleep with one eye open if you screwed up or whatever, whereas the opposite is true there.
Let me give you just a real simple illustration. I was at the wall when it was coming down, in Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
And while I was there were a lot of people selling their uniforms that were in the East German Army and so on and so forth. And
as like artifacts or something?
No, it was just their whole uniform.
Mm.
And I picked up a hat, and with a brim on it, And I looked at it and I said, "This is crap. It is really
bad, huh?
Bad compared to the hats that we had."
Yeah.
I mean, and so I realized it just reinforced my opinion that these people really didn't know how to make things and so on and so forth. Let me give you another illustration. There was a guy that came across and got a job in a Western factory in West Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
And the day he went to work, all of a sudden the assembly line shut down. Everybody there could pull a cord or whatever it was, punch a button. If there was some emergency, to shut the production line down. So the guy in charge goes down to this fellow, this brand new guy from East Germany, and says, "What's the problem?" He says, "Well, I've run out of bolts." And the guy says, "Well, couldn't you go to the supply room and get more bolts?" And the guy says, "You mean there's more?" See, they have a system of so much every day, and that's the quota, and that's what you do.
Yeah.
And so the whole thing is different from what we do in the West. We have abundance, and they have scarcity.
Yeah, well, that's unfortunately beginning. I think beginning to change. But I mean, staying back on that, it's like the quality of what was produced in the West is also an explanation, I would think, of why they always had to steal technology in the East. That's how they operated, right? They stole the technology. They didn't so much create anything. They still do, right?
Well, I mean, Boeing, for instance, has a research lab in Russia. Thank you very much. It's kind of a joke. I mean, here you've got Boeing helping the Chinese, for instance, build large frame aircraft in China, while in the United States they're helping build anti-aircraft guns to shoot those planes down that they're helping build in China.
Money coming from all sides, huh? Is that really what this all comes down to? Have these corporations, has it just come down to the money? Because there is a more center-left narrative coming from people who know there's a conspiracy, who know there's insiders and whatnot. But their take on it is that this is turning into a corporate fascist-type global system.
Well, there is that, but there's always the allure of wealth, of money, and so on and so forth. But in the end, that's really not what it is. It's power. And so you've got to kind of figure out that these guys, we're dealing with megalomaniacs. They don't think normally, okay?
Yeah, that seems to be why we have such a hard time, why we are so naive, I would think. We just can't think like these lunatics.
Yeah, well, you have to. You have to, when people say, well, how come you know this and you know that? I says, you got to think like a criminal. You really do.
Yeah.
You have to think, if I want to do this, for instance, if I want to rob a bank, what am I going to have to think about? What am I going to have to do in order to rob the bank? Okay, if I want to rule the world or this country or whatever, what am I going to have to do that?
Yeah.
And
it's interesting that they even want to do that. Like, that's such a, I have a hard time supervising the one or two people it's like, I'd rather not, but they want to rule over everyone. That's so demented, huh?
Well, it's demonic. And there's only one step from demonic to satanic. And we're dealing with people that really are not Christian in their outlook, and all that means.
They're not moral, not even.
They're not moral. They're amoral.
Yeah.
Whatever it takes to get ahead, and so on and so forth. And you can look at at history, whether you're talking about Saddam Hussein, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Benito Mussolini, any of these people, and the more current one like Z, and I would even say Biden, and people like that. They're consummate liars. I mean, they lie like it's just with ease.
Yeah.
And they will do anything and say anything to promote their power. That's what it is.
That's.
But they want to. The thing is that all of them have a philosophy of a one world government. All of them. Now, how are we going to juxtaposition ourselves to bring about that one world power? But I want to be the guy that's going to be the one in power.
Yeah.
And the other guys, they may help me get there, but I'm going to kill them as soon as we get this thing together.
Well, that's what happened in the Soviet Union over and over.
And
next guy comes in, everyone's, half of his people are, they're like, okay, go kill so-so, and it's like 3 people left, and he brings in you.
Well, that's what happened with Saddam Hussein. The first week that he came to power, he had a meeting of the Ba'ath Party. And he says, you go out and shoot him, and you go out and shoot him. And the guys had to do it because they knew if they didn't, both of them would die.
Yeah. These people are just, you think there's people that, I think this is what, another thing people have a hard time imagining is it's like we may know some of the history, or maybe we'll watch a History Channel documentary or something else, and we see how ruthless, whether it be the Soviets, whether it be Mao Zedong over there with his, agrarian reform, and we're like, but I think most people would say, that can't happen today. There's no one that ruthless.
It's happening right in front of our eyes. It's beginning to happen in front of our eyes. We are facing right now a position of where we could get into a condition of starvation in our own country because of the things that they're doing through this environmental program. Look at the diesel. I mean, we got less than a month's supply of diesel. Can anybody contemplate what's going to happen at the grocery store or at the gas pump or anywhere else if we run out of diesel? We won't have trucks moving any of those supplies out to people. Not just things to buy in the stores, but things to eat.
Yeah.
Things to get us from A to B in our cars and everything else.
Well, they say the food shortages, and going back to war, that's another thing that seems to be blamed on the food shortage, that some of it which we are experiencing, and I think around the world they're experiencing it even more. And of course the forecast is gloomy, but for instance in Ukraine, my understanding is there's a great pile of grain that's no longer being produced and coming out. So that's another consequence of war, right?
Yeah, they haven't been able to harvest what they've got. They haven't been able to ship what they do have harvested. They're negotiating right now because there's African countries that are going to starve, literally, if they don't get those grains from Russia and the Ukraine.
And all this leads to further unrest, which then maybe would be a great opportunity for someone to be like, look, we need a more unified system here. We can't have all these conflicts, and we need to work together, make sure everyone gets fed, not just the Americans and whatnot.
Yep.
All thanks to wars and many other factors. What were the founding fathers' views on these entanglements out? Because I think if you look at it, one of the arguments against this isolationism, as they call it, is that you just can't do that anymore in today's world. You can't butt out, because sooner or later it's going to end up on your shore. So you might as well get involved early on. You might as well do something.
Well, free trade is not a problem as long as it's one sheet of paper. It's all the other sheets of paper and those 3,000 sheets of every trade agreement that are the problem. If one businessman from a country wants to trade with another businessman from another country, okay, great. But the thing is that our founders, Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, and all of them have publicly stated that we cannot get involved in permanent foreign entanglements, period, because it will abrogate our system of government in the long run because of the things that come along with it.
And they saw that based on, for instance, the Napoleonic Wars and what lots of that had already been happening. I mean,
yes.
Europe was devastated by wars even previous to that. So, like Solomon says, there's nothing new under the sun, huh?
Yeah, that's true.
So, Art, what are the things that we hear from members and supporters is it's like, okay, great, more information. But what can people do? I mean, something like this is just so, it seems such a high bar to get over, such a big task. It's like, what do we do? What does the average person do in this case?
Well, generally what we have to do is, first, we have to do just like the committees of correspondence did, and that's, first of all, create understanding. Now, I'm not talking about educating people. I'm talking about creating understanding in that education. For instance, I saw a video here recently that had a historical bent to it. And I'm sitting there grinding my teeth because while he's giving facts, he's not creating understanding of the situation at the time period he's talking about. So what we have to do is to educate the people in Congress, create an understanding in them, and then pressure them at home to live up to the Constitution of the United States.
What do we educate them? What do we tell them? Hey, you can't be in a conflict if there's no congressional approval. Is that?
Well, that's for one, but it is across a whole spectrum of things that they're doing in Congress now. There's certain things that Congress is allowed to do and certain things it's not allowed to do, period.
Yeah.
But it's being ignored. And so what we have to do is to educate the electorate, and in the process put the fear of you know what, into our congressmen that they're not going to get reelected if they don't vote right.
Right.
For instance, they can come to our website and download the congressional record of
Congressional scorecards,
the scorecard, and then distribute it as widely as they possibly can. That keeps our men and women in Congress honest.
Right.
When they know that there's a group of people out there that are watching them and reporting on them. Now, if they're great people, they love it because that's what they want to do.
Yeah.
But if they're not so great, they will change or they will be changed.
That's the crux of why we exist, is to help people understand, right?
Yes.
We tout ourselves as creating understanding and then organizing. But without a proper understanding, what are you going to organize? How are you going to organize? What are you going to do?
Sure.
Right?
Well, the thing is that just education in and of itself will just lead to frustration, because everybody be down. Oh my goodness, it's just terrible. What can I do about it? I'm only one guy. Well, you're not one guy. You're an important link with a group of people all over the country trying to do something about getting the Congress back to the Constitution.
Well, it took us a long, long time to get to this. I think, maybe people don't understand that because they wake up and all of a sudden everything's crazy, right? And they think it happened overnight. And I think that's one of the most common misconceptions. It's like, no, this got here over decades, if not entire century of various attacks and approaches, whether it be from our media institutions to our educational institutions, all that. They changed the minds, and so now we have leaders who aren't Constitution. They don't have a respect for the Constitution, right? That's a big deal. And now we have an electorate. We have voters, the public, who also doesn't know because, again, they went through education, through K through 12 institutions that they really weren't talking about that, right?
No, they weren't. And in fact, I get very disappointed as I get out and about and give talks, whether it's from Maine to California, that even conservative leaders of conservative organizations don't know the basics.
Yeah.
For instance, the Declaration of Independence proclaims that we get our rights from God.
Yeah.
Now, we've been ordered, we can't have God in the classroom anymore.
Yeah.
Now, if that's the case, how do you even teach the Declaration of Independence? You can't even teach that basic thing that we're the only country that declares that.
Well, you can't even get a large segment of the public to buy into that, especially if they're atheists.
Well, that's true.
No knock on atheists or whatnot, but it's written there in the Declaration of Independence that we have these rights and they're given from God, and that government is here to secure them. Whereas now the prevailing thought seems to be, it's like, oh no, your rights are, what government says they are.
Yeah.
So they've totally, they've derailed that. They've destroyed just that, belief system. And now what does our Constitution hang on if that part of it is not to be believed?
Well, one of the most successful programs that we have in the John Birch Society is getting people to watch the video series, The Constitution as a Solution.
It's great. That's how I got here.
And so that is something that you can do, and once people see it, they will even adopt it into their organizations and everything else. Just like I was on the road here a week ago, and boy, the leadership of this organization was, they didn't know about having this Bircher there as a speaker.
Yeah.
So I disarmed them immediately and then got into my pitch, basically. And by the time it was over, they thought it was great. So you've got sometimes a little hurdle to get over, to be able to explain things to people. But it can be done.
We get them there. So that's definitely the most important. The most important thing we do is create that understanding. Mm-hmm. Any practical steps? We have some legislative alerts, and I'm going to kind of refer people to some of those, including we talked about NATO. There's that. Get us out of NATO. We need to pressure perhaps for a bill to, I don't know what effect that will have. We've had our Get Us Out of the UN campaign. Now, I have heard it's like even from people on the inside, it's like, why do we keep pushing this? This is not happening. You know what my answer to them is? Lots of people thought that Roe v. Wade would never be shot down.
Yes.
And it happened. And it
Yep.
happened after, 5 decades? It happened after a long time. Just because something is not happening as fast as we'd like it to doesn't mean we're going to take back or we're just going to throw away a campaign that is so crucial to us. That campaign signifies, and correct me if I'm wrong, it signifies us saying that we need to be completely separate and we need to get out of these foreign entanglements, these international organizations, like we've talked about. They do no good. It seems that they actually do more harm. So those are 2 steps they can take practically, right? We offer tools and, get a hold of your legislator. But the most important, I would say, like it seems like you would agree, is we have to create this understanding. And this is not an overnight process.
That's true. And the difference between the John Birch Society and all these other conservative organizations is that we know that we're dealing with a conspiracy, and this conspiracy has an agenda.
Yeah.
And so we have to have a counter agenda. And one of those things is to get us out of the UN, because we know that they want us into that thing totally,
Yeah.
to where everything is wrapped up in the UN, like Build Back Better. The Biden program, that's really a UN program. That's not Biden's program at all.
Isn't it a UN slogan?
Yes, it is. You can go to just about every agenda-driven website of the United Nations, and you'll find Build Back Better in there.
Yeah.
It has been their program for a long time.
Yeah. Well, the UN's Agenda 2030, it's 17 goals and it's many others underneath. You look at that, and it's basically a replica of what we're seeing today, what's
Yes.
happening today. So any last words, Art?
Just get busy.
Get busy. There you go. There you go, folks. I think that's good. That's perfect. I mean, that's what it is. As Americans, like we talked about, we have no business getting entangled with any international organizations. They don't accomplish their purported goals. They're corrupt. They soak taxpayers for piles of money. We didn't even really talk about that. They lead us on the path to a one-world government, and they're liable to suck us into more wars. So here's a few things that you can do right away. Like we mentioned, you can tell your U.S. representative and senators to start putting America first and pulling out of international entangling alliances such as NATO. And you can contact your U.S. representatives and senators and urge them to support the American Sovereign Restoration Act, H.R. 7806. This bill would fully withdraw the U.S. from the United Nations and its associated entities. And lastly, get busy. Be a Bircher who birches. If you're not a JBS member, apply. And one way or another, teach others the truth about the real goal of the globalists with these conflicts and enroll them in the cause so they can multiply our education efforts. Imagine what impact we could have if we have thousands of people who began calling their U.S. congressmen or working to get the message out. We need more pullers at the oars, as our founder, Robert Welch, said. Collective pressure works. The leftists have learned this a long time ago. JBS founder Robert Welch said, "Every effort we undertake, every battle we fight, even if we lose it, and every sacrifice we make is cumulative. Every bit of dedication to the cause is worthwhile." So thank you for joining us, and don't forget, at whatever ails society, freedom is the cure.